Hello and welcome to this week's Jump Advisory recruitment discussion. As you can see from the people on the screen, there is Heather and Dave and myself here today because the two Pauls are actually out on client site. Paul Sharp is in Leeds and Paul Jacobs is working from London for a client up in Scotland. So they won't be joining us. That means we've got plenty of time for others to talk because we know how those two love to talk and love to gab. As always, if you can hear me, if you can please put a note into the chat room or into the question box to say that you can hear us. We wish you all a very good morning. We have an interesting debate today on furlough, COVID, and managing your people. And we've brought Heather Solway back to have a discussion with that. But as we said to everybody in the trailer for this, that there's going to be an announcement to make. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over to Heather because I think it'd be nice for Heather to make the announcement. So Heather, good morning to you. I hope you're well.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you very much. Thanks for giving me the chair briefly. Really excited to let people know that I've been persuaded and decided to join Jump on a permanent basis. So very excited about that. So just to give you a little bit of background, I've spent too many years to mention working with recruitment businesses, small startups through established medium-sized businesses right the way through to large corporates. And my specialism is strategic HR consulting. So been doing that on an employed basis, and I'm now moving to join Jump so that I can provide that strategic HR consulting service to Jump's clients and also to bring more of my clients into the Jump field and spread the love. So really excited about that, really excited about joining the guys and working with their clients and my clients, and really spreading the word that HR isn't just about being a gatekeeper. It's not just about risk mitigation. It's not just about hoop jumping and policies and procedures, but strategic HR is about making sure that you're in a position to attract, to engage and to retain the best talent for your organization. And I want to be working, and I hope to be working with our clients to give them a strategic edge, to give them that ability to get the best, to be the most productive by using good HR policy and creating great culture, and driving productivity through good people policies and people strategy. So really excited to be working with the two Pauls, with Dave and with Howard, and so it's good, and some nice comments. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be joining the team.
And clearly welcome aboard. Obviously, Heather, it's great to have you on board, and it's great to have a balance at last on the Jump board. And what I mean by balance is that there's people with hair and people without hair now. So,
I've increased the hair substantially.
Substantially, yeah. Before that, we said we weren't doing anything. We were doing loads and loads for the recruitment market, but nothing for the shampoo market. Well, now we can change that comment and change that statement. But as always, what we like to do when people sort of come into Jump, we like to make sure that we, our clients get our bang for our buck and work from there. And so as I said, we've got a really exciting conversation that's going to be sort of rolling all the way through this 45 minutes. And we're going to start off with furlough. What's happening with furlough, explain what's happening where furlough is now and the impact on business. Because I think what a lot of people don't understand, as furlough starts to unravel and starts to slow down, and September's sort of looming very, very quickly once again, I think it's important that people understand the impact that furlough has had on their business and potentially can have going forward and what that looks like. Pre this webinar, obviously, we had lots of discussions about this, Heather. So, talk to us about furlough and what's actually happening with furlough.
Thanks, Howard. I think furlough for me has been one of the most fascinating aspects of what's been an incredibly challenging year for everyone. Furlough didn't exist before. This is something entirely new. And I think has been driven partly by the government talking to businesses more and having an ear for what businesses need and how they're going to protect jobs in the longer term. So it's been, I think, revolutionary for organisations to have access to furlough and funding, whether that's great for recruitment in the long term is yet to be seen. So if you look in America, where there wasn't a furlough scheme in America, so everybody got laid off in America. Lots of people lost their jobs, but of course now as the economy expands, they're hiring them all again, which is great for recruiters. So I think whether or not the furlough has an impact on recruitment recovery in this country is yet to be seen. But furlough in itself has presented us with a whole host of challenges that we couldn't possibly have foreseen because we've never experienced anything like it. So furlough gave us the ability to have a bench of our staff that we could access government funds to pay, and enabled us to keep people in the background so that when the economy takes off again, they're there again. But of course, that presents itself with a whole host of problems because there are a whole raft of reasons why people were furloughed, and there are a whole raft of reasons why that people's view of furlough, and to some extent I think that's fed by the way we communicated with people. So some people thought furlough was brilliant, and being given the opportunity to be furloughed, people were asking to be furloughed, particularly when the schools weren't in and you had parents who were trying to homeschool. It was certainly easier to homeschool if you were furloughed rather than you were trying to do a full-time job in the homeschool. You had people viewing very positively the fact that their organisations were facilitating furlough and enabling them to effectively stay employed. But you have other people who really felt very negatively about furlough and felt that being benched effectively was saying they weren't valued, and they weren't as important as they were kind of the B team. I don't think that's the case at all, but it really does depend on how the organisation communicated with you about furlough. And of course, we did never expect furlough to go on for this long, and so we have people potentially in organisations who are still furloughed are a year on. What does that do to somebody's mental health, and what can we as organisations do about that?
I think it's very interesting as we talk about furlough and we talk about how furlough has affected everybody. We see it from a very different side as business owners and senior managers, etc., because we're probably the ones that weren't furloughed, and therefore we've worked all the way through lockdown and COVID. And I think that, speaking to lots of clients who are saying that they're almost having a split company now, where they've got those that are coming back from furlough who've enjoyed their lockdown experience, and then you have those that have been sort of working who've had an absolute, all hands to the pump type experience. Yeah. And that causes a very sort of different dynamic within the business. And as you start to say there, the impact on health, etc. But it's also the impact on how people are seen and perceived. And we have lots of people, as you described, that people that loved to be on furlough and thought it was a great idea, and then after being on furlough hated it. You've got people who love to be on furlough and don't really want to come back from furlough because they're loving it so much. You have people who are working from home and enjoy working from home and don't want to come back into the office. You have people working from home who hate working from home and want to be back in the office, etc. There's such a sort of conundrum of all those type of things sort of coming up. In your experience, and obviously you've been dealing with some quite large recruitment agencies and smaller companies as well, as you've sort of removed from being sort of employed to sort of self-employed. Give us your view of how clients have been sort of helping or catering with all those different things and different anomalies to ensure that their staff are absolutely the primary objective of their sort of HR policy in looking after their staff, is to make sure that they're absolutely fit for work and fit for purpose in what's going on.
Yeah. Howard, I've seen a huge continuum of responses to furlough and to the particular problems that opportunities that presents. So from organisations that just basically parked people on a bench and then there was no more to be heard, right through to organisations who have really used this a way of engaging with their staff in a better way. So built better communication strategy. And that's linked to remote working as well. You can't assume that people are going to pick stuff up at the water cooler. Or in the organisation. So I've seen organisations respond with fantastic communication strategy, with making sure that because they can't just send comms to people on work emails and to kind of mailing lists, they've had to communicate with individuals, and they've had to build strategies to communicate with people on furlough, and to make sure that the people on furlough still know what's going on with the organisation and are in touch with the organisation. It's not, there's a lot of comparisons actually with if you're out of the workplace on a 12-month maternity leave, for example, or been out of the workplace on a 12-month furlough placement. Bringing those people back, keeping them engaged. You've got keeping in touch days. You can't have people at work, but flexible furlough is slightly different. But with your main furlough, people are keeping them in touch with the organisation and keeping them in touch with change and keeping them in touch with opportunity, and helping people to see where the end might be. And that, I think that's been very difficult actually, because none of us have known where the end might be. But for me, the fundamental on this is communication, is clear, transparent and effective communication. So Dave, I think you're nodding because you agree with me, but we have to make sure that we're honest with people about not knowing when the end is, but not forgetting about people when they're on furlough, but keeping communication going with people.
We've always said, haven't we? We've always said that one of the key skills as a manager, as a leader, is to build trust.
Yes.
That trust is such a strong currency for the way forward. I think some of the people I've been speaking to have handled the whole thing very, very well. One or two perhaps less well, and have almost thought, well, I didn't do very well at the beginning. That's it. It's done for. And I would want to encourage people to say, if you haven't done as well as you had wanted to at the beginning of all of this, there's still time. There are still people on furlough. You can still communicate with them effectively well. And as our businesses grow and as we seek to hire people, there's some really good people perhaps that we have on furlough as well that we need to re-engage with. So I would just encourage people to continue or even start proper communication, because it really does work.
Yeah, I think you're right. If you're not communicating with people you've got on furlough already, you need to be starting to communicate with them. And one of the key things I think about recruitment at the moment is that we are starting to see the economy opening up. We are starting to see the numbers of vacancies rising, the number of opportunities. We're starting to see recruitment businesses advertising for staff. And so for those who aren't recruiting yet, and for those for whom business levels are not at the point where they can bring people back from furlough, remembering that your furloughed staff are going to be targets for headhunters who are going to be recruiting your talent is really important. So making sure that you are not leaving them vulnerable to being because presumably you put them on furlough because you valued them and you wanted them to be part of your future. So staying in touch with them and making sure they understand that they're still part of your future, and giving them an idea of when the end date might be and how you're going to transition them back to work and how they're going to start being productive again, makes them less vulnerable, I think, to being poached by your competitors.
So there's two questions to come from there, I think, Heather. And one of the questions is, what you're saying is that you've put people on furlough because that they're a good member of your team, but you have no work. But there's lots of companies that have put people on furlough because they really want to get rid of them, and they're seeing this as an easy option to get rid of them. And every recruitment agency is different. There are some recruitment agencies that have boomed through lockdown, and there's others that have zero work whatsoever, and they're just starting to see green shoots now. And so they've put people on furlough for the right reasons, but also there's a lot of recruitment agencies that chose to put people on furlough rather than make them redundant. How does that sort of affect now as we start to come out of furlough? What would be your comments to those people who've put people on furlough, but they are actually going to get rid of them? That's a very different communication and very different conversation to have with those people. What would your suggestions to be there?
I think that I would say just be cautious and be careful. So I don't think furlough was a good reason for putting stuff off, unless you genuinely believe that there was a job for them to come back to. Putting them on furlough was just delaying the inevitable. And the government encouraged organisations to do that. The government encouraged organisations to keep people on furlough rather than make them redundant. And in fact, in the early days, you were encouraged, if you had let anybody go, to bring them back and put them on furlough, because it's a way of the government distributing state funding to people who can't work, rather than through universal credit or other forms of benefit. So there was an encouragement to do that. And I think all the time that you think you have a viable job to bring them back to at some point in the future, or at least a possibility of a viable job to bring them back to, I think that's utterly legitimate to do. But in a market as we are now, where we are seeing vacancies in recruitment growing, and we are seeing organisations who want talent, if you have someone on furlough who you do not expect to come back, it's much better to deal with it now in a transparent way. I think purely from a kind of HR legal point of view, the longer somebody is on furlough, the more service they're getting, and the more risk you have ultimately if you want to let them go. Your redundancy costs go up the longer that they're with you. And when we were talking about a few months, it didn't make any difference, but it's been a year, right? Potentially you've got people who've been out of the workplace, they've got a year's more service than they had at the beginning. So I don't think it's always a great idea to put off those sorts of decisions. But as you say, it is a way for people to access funds, and at least currently at only small cost to the employer. Of course, come the summer in July, the costs of having your staff on furlough will go up, and you will be expected to contribute. So I suspect there will be less people given access to furlough funding, and it will become much more about only those people we want to retain for the future, or who have other reasons like childcare or shielding issues that stay on furlough.
So do you think that...
Heather, you alluded to it earlier, but the recruitment industry, for the most part, is bouncing back.
It is, yeah.
There are certain sectors that aren't, but clearly most sectors are. Most of the companies that I'm in contact with are desperately trying to hire new people, having brought some of their furloughed people back. But is it right that if you're on furlough, you can work for somebody else?
Yes, that's right. So there's nothing...
Somebody on furlough could go and work for a competitor.
Yeah. So the rules of furlough say that if you are furloughed by your employer, you are allowed during that furlough to work for someone else. So you have to tell HMRC so that you're paying tax on your furlough income and your other income. But there are the only thing that would limit who you could work for would be the contract that you have with your original employer. So if you have no restrictions in your contract about what people working for you can do, so whether you limit whether they can go and work for somebody else at the same time, then there is nothing actually to stop you working for a competitor. So if your contract with them, your original contract says you can't work for a competitor, or you need the permission of the company to work for someone else when you're working for us, there's actually nothing in the furlough rules that says that you can't work for someone else and that you can't work for a competitor. So again, it's part of the key communication. So when you put people on furlough, did you say to them, actually the rules are that you can work? And some people have done fantastically useful things. I'm aware of people who've become ambulance drivers or voluntary workers, worked in food banks, all kinds of paid and unpaid work that's been hugely useful. I'm sure there's a whole load of Amazon and DHL and DPD drivers who are actually furloughed from other jobs and that are doing that. And there's going to be a whole host of other issues when they're wanted back in their original jobs. But there's nothing actually in the rules that stops you working for a competitor unless that's what you have in your own rules. And you've made that clear to somebody who's been furloughed that they need to tell you if they're going to work for somebody else and give you permission.
Does that change that if you start to think about that when most people's employment contract, that clause, the restrictive clause and the covenants clause, normally kicks in when people resign, and it's that on resign these clauses now become active. Now, obviously, these people haven't resigned or haven't been dismissed from the company. So
Yeah,
do those
that's
clauses
right.
still stand in the contract, or are those clauses now almost inverted commas null and void because they're on furlough, so they could go work for the competitor next door and not have an issue with that? I mean,
Yeah. So the post termination clauses, your generic restrictions, they don't apply to this situation because, as you say, this isn't post termination, so they haven't left yet. So those type of restrictions, but there are many contracts of employment say while you are working for us, you should not undertake any other economic activity without the permission of the organisation. So they are effectively saying you can't do anything else unless we know about it when you work for us. Not everybody knows to put that in their contract of employment. So it's not a given. And it is something that if you think there's any risk around, you really ought to check your own contracts and see what's in there. But it would be a separate clause to those post-termination restrictions. As you rightly say, Howard, they wouldn't apply.
so as we move on, because obviously some clients think that, rightly or wrongly, that the way the furlough was set out is that you couldn't go work for a competitor. What you're saying is that isn't correct, that they could go work for a competitor. There's nothing in furlough saying that you can't do that.
There's nothing in the furlough rules. Yeah, it has to be in the rules between the employer and the furloughed individual. Yeah.
Okay, so as we sort of move this conversation on, obviously there's been a massive psychological impact on businesses, on employees, on employers. If you're hiring, what impact does that sort of psychological impact have on your staff? So let's look at, say, you're bringing people back from furlough. What impact does that have on the staff? If you're employing people, what does that have impact on the people that are maybe still on furlough?
Yeah. And actually, just to say, just before we move on, there was one thing I wanted to say about the redundancy situation. You can't use the fact that somebody's been on furlough as a justification for choosing that person for redundancy. So if you choose the furloughed person to be made redundant, you've got a potentially unfair reason for choosing them. So you do still need to pull the person on furlough in with your existing staff. So you do need to think very carefully. Obviously, the longer service somebody has, the more serious that question becomes. But you do need to think about being on redundancy isn't a justifiable. Sorry, being on furlough isn't a justifiable reason for being selected for redundancy. So it's worth.
You still have to follow the traditional redundancy process where you put the position at redundancy, not the person, and then everyone within that position then has to go through that same process.
Yeah. So you're still talking about having a consultation period to justify why you're choosing that person. Yeah. So I just think that's worth mentioning. So in terms of psychological contract, I think it's really interesting because the way in which we've handled people on furlough impacts on the way people who stayed at work feel. So I know some organisations actually rotated people on and off furlough, and the flexibility of the scheme has been great to enable you to do that, because there are some people who've been expected to stay at work who felt very resentful of the people who were sat at home. In the perception is doing nothing, but of course we all know that the people sat and weren't doing nothing at all. But there was some interesting dynamics about the at work team and the furlough team, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and as leaders to acknowledge that everybody's perspective is valid, and that leadership role of understanding that there will be people who feel very positively about furlough opportunities and people who feel very negatively about it, and being acknowledging and being open about that is I think important from a leadership perspective. And then there's the point about recognizing the understandable anxiety that being asked to come back to work after a period of furlough will have. So there are some people who actually have really enjoyed being on furlough and not having to travel and being able to do, homeschooling or volunteering or whatever. And there is some natural anxiety about coming back to work in the way there would be after any period. And I think acknowledging that is important and looking for signs of that anxiety, particularly if you're an organisation that wants people to come back to the office straight away rather than continuing to allow people to work remotely. It's a very different transition from being on furlough at home to working at home, rather than being on furlough at home and coming back to the office and going into a 5-day commute again. So I think thinking about how you transition people back to work, thinking about whether or not there's the option to include a period of flexible furlough. So flexible furlough is that opportunity to have some periods of work and some periods of furlough mixed together, and that's a great opportunity almost to phase people back to work, and to start to build up a pipeline so that when they're back at work, they're earning commission as well, because for some people it will have been a significant cut in pay.
So I think there's a big sort of, and this is the impact that the whole situation of lockdown, furlough, and everything that's going around that is going to happen. This is where management will start to become a real pressure point for people. Because obviously, as we come out of furlough, what we're seeing is the vaccination program having a tremendous effect on the working capabilities of the UK compared to the rest of the world. And as we start to drive that, but that causes separate different issues, because obviously you're going to have various different people coming back from furlough, people working from home, people working in the business, but you're now going to have also people who are pro-vaccination and anti-vaccination. And that's going to cause a real conundrum from a management point of view. What can you do? What can't you do with regards to demanding people coming into the office, etc., demanding people having vaccinations? You know, there was a big thing on Monday or Sunday, I can't remember what day it was now, when Boris was talking about the COVID passports, and yet they're not in rollout 2, they're not going to be in rollout 3, but he hasn't discounted them what they're going to be and what that would look like. So looking at where we are now, and considering lateral flow is now available free of charge to absolutely everybody, what would be your advice with regards to management to manage the impact of all of these things as they start to drive their business, as the market starts to really pick up? Because they want to get up to speed very, very quickly. Yeah. But all of these things will become a real big sort of headache at some point.
Yeah, and I think when you're leading an organisation, you know, the last 12 months has taught us part of leadership is dealing with stuff getting thrown at you all the time that you're having to deal with, that no one's ever dealt with before. You know, you can't just go Google the answer. So leadership in these times is really challenging and interesting. And I think that this particular set of challenges around lateral flow testing, passporting, return to the office, I think that presents a massive challenge for leaders. Some of the things that I would encourage leaders to do in that situation is, first of all, is consult with your staff. So don't assume that you've got all the answers or that you have to have all of the answers. I think being a consultative leader in a situation of great change and great challenge is only ever going to be a good thing. And so talking to your staff and listening to your staff is really important. You know, not assuming that we've got all the answers or have to have them. So I think that's a really important thing to understand. And in terms of what you can and you can't do, first of all, this is a moving feast. This changes all of the time. So keeping an eye on what the government are saying, and because we do know that they do change what they're saying occasionally. And so we do need to keep an eye on what's going on the news and what's happening. So with testing, things to think about are, is it going to help you with your stated ambition? So do you want people back in the office? If you want people back in the office rather than allowing them to continue to work remotely, you're more likely than not to want to think about whether or not you use testing. If you have testing, how do you want to manage that? So how are you going to keep information about test results? How are you going to record that? How are you going to administer it? How are you going to follow it through? What are you going to do about people who don't want to test? Is it a purely voluntary program that you have, or do you want to make it more mandatory? And there's no right answer to any of this, but these are some of the things that you need to think about. So some people will be reluctant to take tests. Some people can't wait to get their hands on testing. But you just need to think about, what are you going to do? But if you make it obligatory, what are you going to do about the people who don't want to do it? The other thing to think about is one of the downsides of testing is, and the lateral flow testing is, they are only one tiny part of your battery in your goal of keeping your workplace COVID secure. So there is one argument that if people get a false negative, that they relax their guard. So they get a negative COVID, a lateral flow test, and they go, well, that's it, I definitely haven't got COVID. And so they change their behavior at work. And actually, even if you're getting a negative lateral flow test, you need to be keeping up your COVID safe and COVID secure behaviors at work. So the social distancing, the encouraging hand washing, the making, cleaning available, not having shared equipment, all of those things, you can't let that drop. The testing is only one facet of the things in your tool bag to make sure that your staff are safe at work and feel safe at work. So I think that's important. And I think vaccination comes alongside that, Howard. The whole piece about vaccination will depend very much on your staff, your goal of bringing people back to work or not bringing them back to work. And then there's a whole set of other things to do with your temporary workers. So if you're a recruitment business that has temporary workers out on client sites, you've got to think about your client site rules. So some of them are really straightforward. If they're working in care homes or hospitals, it's very likely that vaccinations are going to be required either already or very soon. So having some kind of policy statement about how you're going to do that's really important.
So what we're saying is that, the COVID laws with regards to bringing people back into work still stand irrespective of people being tested, people doing the lateral flow, and people having the vaccination. So if you've got let's say an office of 20, and when you divide it out by the COVID rules, we can only put 6 in that office, you can still only put 6 in that office. You can't suddenly put 20 people back in that office because everyone's had a lateral flow and everyone feels happy. We still have to abide by the COVID stipulations that we have there.
Yeah. Testing is only one part of your COVID rules. Yeah, it's only one part of it. And at the moment, the rules still are to work from home if you can. Yeah, so it'll be middle of June, I think, 21st of June, before actually there's it's fine for everybody to come back to the office.
So one of the questions that have come in is obviously the question that everyone's, I suppose, is burning on everyone's mindset at the moment is holidays. So again, if people go on holidays, what's the perception then from a business point of view that I take a holiday and I go somewhere that, isn't as COVID friendly as it could be, and I've got to then spend 14 days isolation when I come back. So I could have had a 14-day holiday, then I've got to spend 14 days in isolation, etc. How do clients, how do companies sort of deal with that situation where that's a stipulation by the law, what people have to do? Is that going to prohibit people from saying you can take a holiday?
This is really challenging. I think this is really challenging. I don't think we should be in a position ever to stop people taking holidays. I think we should be actively encouraging people to take holidays. And I think that it's incredibly difficult to argue that when somebody comes back, if they're then required to self-isolate for 2 weeks, that as an organisation we couldn't manage that, because we've managed people working from home remotely for the last year. And so the idea that we're going to say to them, you can't go on holiday because you can't work from home for 2 weeks when you get back, is quite a difficult argument to make. I mean, it's possible to make it. And if you are an organisation that absolutely justifies a requirement to be in the office, you could have that as a rule. But I think it's a very difficult argument to make when people have been effectively working from home for a long period of time. And again, for me, it's about being transparent and consulting with your staff, and being an open and having clear rules that you communicate clearly.
It's interesting because I think we have these dates like May the 17th and the 21st of June. And I think there are some people out there who think, well, everything will go back to what it was like pre-COVID. And I think what COVID has done, it's changed the whole workplace dynamic. And importantly for us as leaders, it's changed the psychological contract we have. Yeah. We've got the piece of paper that we work with. We can do this, we can't do this, but we've got a psychological contract now. And your point, Heather, there about holidays is a great one. people have got used to working from home, ideally, because we like the buzz of the office and shouting across desks and all of that, ideally, many companies will think it would be great to have everybody back, that team spirit, everybody potentially can get vaccinated, all of that. But actually, there'll be a lot of people who won't want that.
Yeah.
And how we respond to those people psychologically is going to help determine how successful we will be as a business. Because somehow most businesses have coped with people working from home. Some of them can probably stay working from home if they are feeling that they don't want to get on a train, or they don't want to get on a bus, or even if they don't want to drive their car to work. You know, we've got to address that, because it won't go back to exactly what it was like before.
I think it's really interesting that everybody, as you say, is talking about going back to normal on the 21st of June, but the furlough scheme runs to September.
Yeah.
You know, there's a reason why the furlough scheme runs to September. And so I think let's hope for the best and plan for the worst. So I think I don't think we yet know what is going to happen in the summer. And I'm not sure that we are able to bring everybody back into offices, nor should we try to. And I do think that we need to continue to be open-minded about our hybrid solutions. I think somebody's just popped a question about it, about encouraging people to come back in. The current rules are you should work from home if you can. There is no reason why you can't have offices open that are COVID secure, and that you would make them available to people. I know some organisations are asking people to come in. Personally, I don't think it's a great shout right now to make people come in. I think it's much better to give them that option if they want to use it, because for some people it's certainly better. Some people choose actively to work in the home, but I think it would be unwise to force people to come back in the office, or even really to encourage them to come back in, but just to make that choice available to them right now. That will change as the year goes on, and it will change as the country is vaccinated and we see what happens with variants, and we see what happens with testing. But I do think it's tricky to be forcing people to come into offices right now.
So I understand that, because I agree that, I think, come the actual full lockdown release, I still think there'll be lots of rules still in place that won't be released and relinquished at that stage, such as the 2 meter rule and things like that. I think they will still be in place. I think the masks will be still in place in public places. But we have a bigger problem always to think about when we talk about that vaccination program. Of obviously there's a lot of people who don't want to be vaccinated, and there's lots of people who can't be vaccinated. How does a company stand on that if they say they want everybody to be vaccinated to have a better safeguard in the workplace? How does that feel? On the flip side of that, how do you think staff and managers will feel from a mental point of view, if they understand there are people in the office that haven't been vaccinated? There's no guarantee that the vaccination will stop you getting COVID, as we know, but obviously there's a higher chance if there's people in there who have no vaccination against getting the virus at all. Yeah,
I think this is a really unfolding situation, and I'm not sure any of us are really quite clear how that's going to work. For me, my position is that I encourage people to be vaccinated. I encourage them to seek out reputable sources of information about it and to make their own choices. But I think broadly, except in exceptional circumstances, which I'll define in a second, I think it's personal choice. And everybody will have a different view on that. The only situation where I think it's utterly justified to insist on vaccination is in a care setting or a hospital setting. And really, historically, that's always been the case. Anybody who puts nurses, medical professionals, care workers forward for contract jobs knows that there's a whole host of special training they have to do and lists of vaccinations they have to have. And I suspect that the COVID vaccination will become one of them. If you are placing workers in those kinds of environments, you need some kind of policy statement now, or, because you are going, if you haven't already, you are going to have clients who are going to ask you to check whether or not somebody has had a vaccination or not. And so you need a position, because we need to be very clear with contractors that and temporary workers that if they are not vaccinated, they will be not be able to work in particular settings, because that is the client's policy. And also the reverse is, if they are already working there when that policy comes in, it is likely that their assignment will end. So, those sorts of policy statements about your contractors are really important. And your policy statement about what you do is for you to decide, for your organisation. But I think there are very few employers outside of a care setting or a hospital setting where they're actually saying, absolutely, you can't work without a passport. It's kind of too soon for us to understand how that's going to evolve. And at the moment, not everybody can get vaccinated. Yeah. So we're still working our way through the lists of people. So I think it's an evolving situation. But certainly if you're placing temporary workers in client sites where there are vaccination policies, you need to be prepping for that.
So there's the question there that you mentioned, contractors and temps working on client site who may have a vaccination policy and may not, etc., etc. Who's liable for the safeguard of that candidate? Because obviously some of those candidates are working through their own limited companies under IR30 or outside IR30, depending on what they're doing, and the change of the law coming up. Some are working as a PAYE through the recruitment agency or through an umbrella company, etc. So who's actually liable for ensuring those things are in place and ensuring that person's well-being is looked after?
It's a really interesting and very complicated question. So the reality is you have a shared responsibility for that. So broadly, there is a sharing of responsibility between the client and the agency. There's certainly conduct regs gives agencies some responsibility for getting health and safety information and making sure that health and safety information is passed on to candidates. Ultimately, clients are responsible for deciding on compliance requirements, which will include things like vaccinations. So clients are responsible for that decision, and we implement it, but we're not responsible for their decision. So it's a complicated. There isn't a clear answer.
It's a really interesting conversation. We're all like, Dave, you're going to say something there, I think.
I was just going to say that there's a lot of what we're discussing. There isn't a definitive, clear answer. And I think it's important as leaders that we reflect that to our people and say, actually, we don't have the answer to that right now. We are following government advice, which is as much as we can go on. Comes back to what we said at the very beginning about building that trust. It's okay not to know every answer to every question. And it's okay to say as a leader, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't got the answer to that yet. We're just going to play it by ear and see what happens. Because I think people are more comfortable with that honesty and integrity than they will do if you try to make up a policy on the hoof or you try to promise something that you don't know that you can deliver.
Yeah. And I think whatever your position statement or your policy statement is, it is a current policy statement, and that it's in an evolving situation. And this is our current thinking. And as and when it changes and evolves, we will let you know that it changes and evolves. I think is a much more honest, leadership position to take.
I think it's an interesting sort of view when you look at it in that way. And the view is, as a manager, what Dave said is absolutely right. You haven't got all the answers, but it's go away and seeking the answers, and it's seeking them from a reputable source. And as we know, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc., aren't reputable sources. You go away and actually find the proper answer and then apply that as you see fit to your business. And to me, that everything that sort of we've talked about in this webinar, and this is not our usual webinar because this is very sort of, there's no defined answer to anything, and there's no defined movement of everything. But this is what's happening right now in the marketplace, not just the recruitment marketplace, as people start to return to work and turn to, inverted commas, some normality of work. So to finish this off, one last question, and I'm going to push it back onto the question. If you had to give one piece of advice to business owners about either re-engaging staff on furlough or recruiting for a position while staff are on furlough, what would that piece of advice be?
Take time over your decisions and consult widely. So talk to your staff about what you're doing, ask their opinions, ask for their feedback, so that you make careful and considered leadership decisions.
Because the decisions that people are going to make in the next few months are going to determine the next few years. And if we've learned one thing through this whole COVID situation, is it has changed how people see employers.
Yeah.
Whether you're a 3-person organization or a 60-person organization or a 6,000-person organization, COVID has made people look at employers differently. So if you haven't made the great decisions, then you've got time to change them. If you've made great decisions, keep making them, but keep consulting, keep talking, and don't knee jerk now.
I think to put that in a recruitment
so far, don't knee jerk now at the end.
I think to put that in a recruitment point of view, Dave, is very simple. Is that, if we're making knee-jerk reactions to everything, then we're never going to move forward. And recruitment, if we go pre-lockdown, in most cases was very transactional. And the way we managed our staff was very transactional. It wasn't very behaviorally led, but what lockdown has brought is a very understanding of that well-being of their staff, well-being of their employees, well-being of candidates, etc. And therefore it's become more of a behavioral employment marketplace than a normal marketplace, and therefore you're looking at people who behave in certain ways and have certain types of values. So it's changed the recruitment market hugely. Heather, obviously that's time up, so thank you very much for your time, but you're not off the hook yet, because next week what we want to talk about is proper coaching versus mentoring. We want to discuss the differences and the similarities between coaching and mentoring. And I put a post out this week about, it's not about coaching the problem, it's about coaching the person that will then help relieve the problem and remove the problem. If you just address the problem, you may still have a problem with that person that's actually causing that problem, etc. So coaching and mentoring is very, very different things, and it's about how we run that and how we develop that moving forward, because coaching is very much about the behavioral assets of your people, not about anything more than that. So we want to sort of look at that. So Heather, you're back next week on that, hopefully Paul will be back as well. Dave, thank you for your time. Heather, welcome to Jump. I hope you've enjoyed your first official Jump webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. Enjoy Hump Wednesday, and we'll see you all next week.
Cheers, Heather. Thanks, Heather. Cheers, everybody.